Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for an Artex Academy webinar. Today's webinar is on transition cow housing, and we're going to be speaking with Courtney Halbach from the Dairyland Initiative. So I'm going to pass this over to Courtney shortly, but just so you know, throughout the webinar, you can ask any questions you have through the question and answer section, or you can ask it through our chat. We'll be answering questions towards the end of the presentation, where we'll have a quick little poll asking you how we did today. So I will pass it over to you, Courtney. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Karen. I'm happy to be here and welcome everyone. I hope everyone is healthy and well wherever you're joining us from. So excited to be here, excited to talk about transition cow housing with all of you today. We're going to look at what are some of the key concepts for barn design, talk about different approaches to calving management, as well as the pre-fresh and post-fresh periods, and then finalize with a little bit of take-homes with just basic pen elements, and give you a guideline or a recipe for what every transition cow barn should have. So here's a little bit of the outline today. We've come up with some of these recommendations over the last 20 years, both from research and clinical experience. Many years ago, there was a priority to build new barns for lactating cows, but the poor transition cows were often put in old facilities or just kind of put off to the side and forgotten about, and then oftentimes had very poor performance after calving. And so now there's been this renewed interest in building new barns to optimize transition cow health and performance. And so today, all the info that I'm going to be giving you is going to focus on optimizing transition cow health and her performance after calving. Starting with the Wisconsin blueprint. So back in 2004, Dr. Nigel Cook and colleagues went out and did a survey of herds in Wisconsin, and they were looking at and trying to figure out what farms were doing in terms of fresh cow management and where were they housing them. And out of that survey, they came away with 4 key points that all of the top performing farms were following or doing. And that was providing 30 inches of bunk space for the 21 days prior and after calving to ensure that all the cows could eat at the same time. They were also providing deep, loose bedded free stalls that were sized to accommodate the size of the animal using them, and they were on a comfortable or dry bedded pack. Then they weren't overstocking the pens. They were being very cautious and limiting 1 cow per stall, or at least 100 square feet of bedded pack per cow. And again, this is that 21 days before and after calving. And then for cows at the point of calving, we're looking at closer to about 150 square feet of bedded pack space per cow. And then these farms were also not regrouping cows during that critical period, 2 to 7 days before calving, to keep dry matter intake up and also reduce as much regrouping stress as possible. But we weren't, after so many years, things change, and we were wondering, what have herds done differently now in the past 10 years since the first survey? And so we went back out. We randomly selected 75 herds that were stratified by the Transition Cow Index, 43 of which responded, and we ended up visiting for the survey in 2015. The average herd size was about 900 cows with a range of 225 to just over 3,000. And the average rolling herd average of milk was about 28,000 pounds of milk. The target dry period was 55 days in length, and some of the herds used BST. And so to summarize what we found out of that survey in 2015, we found that almost all of the herds utilize a far off and pre-fresh dry cow groups. And depending on the lactation stage of the cow, if it's a first lactation heifer, that average time in the pre-fresh pen was 24 days, whereas for mixed groups, in later lactations, it was closer to 21. And this pre-fresh group that I'm mentioning, when I say pre-fresh, I'm talking about cows 21 days before calving, and the far off dry would be cows 55 to 60 days before calving, and fresh cows or post-fresh cows would be the cows 21 days post-calving. Then getting back to the survey, about a third of the farms managed these groups based on lactation, and almost 75% of the herds had a dedicated maternity pen for calving, with the average time spent in that maternity pen less than a day. And then post-calving, these herds, very few of them had a dedicated colostrum pen, whereas 30% of the herds moved them into the sick pen, and the remaining went into a fresh cow lactating pen. Of the herds, 65% had a dedicated sick pen, so this means no fresh cows were in this pen, and that sick pen was sized to accommodate about 3.5% of the total herd size. And in those herds that had a sick pen, only 46% of them had fresh cows mixed in. And then 93% of herds had a dedicated fresh pen, with very few having separate pens for different parities. And you can see that that fresh pen duration of stay was a little bit less than what the pre-fresh pen was. And that's because when cows are ready to move on, or if you need space in your fresh pen, you can let cows out earlier into the main lactating cow group. And so when we looked at the different housing types that were being used for each of these pens, the majority of farms were using a freestall system for the far off dry, and for the most part in the pre-fresh as well. But then you started to see a little bit more usage of bedded packs for the pre-fresh group. The maternity pen was mostly a group setting. So you had multiple cows that would be calving on a bedded pack in one group, with some, about a third, using an individual pen system. And then post-calving, almost all of the herds use a fresh cow pen, with 80% of the herds using a freestall pen for the sick cows. Only 11% were using a bedded pack. And then another key question we were wondering was, what is headlock usage looking like in the pre-fresh and fresh pen? And so you see a little bit less usage of headlocks in the pre-fresh pen at about 61%. And the fresh pen, there was a lot more usage at 86%. Then looking at each group and narrowing down on stocking density and bunk space per cow, you can see in these highlighted red numbers that farmers were very cautious about the stocking density in these pens, especially those cows closer to calving. So in the far off dry groups, there would be about 1 cow per stall, with about 26 inches of bunk space per cow. And so again, if we go back to what we learned in the 2004 survey, we're aiming for 30 inches of bunk space and at least 1 stall per cow in this pre-fresh and post-fresh periods. Now you can see that these farms are well under those recommendations or above. So we were looking at more like 0.8, 0.9 cows per stall in that pre-fresh and post-fresh pens. And there was plenty of optimum bunk space available for these animals, especially in the pre-fresh pen. So a lot of these farms took those recommendations to heart and realized the importance of reducing stocking density, as well as providing enough bunk space in the transition cow pens. So combining what we learned in 2004 with what we learned in 2015, we put together a new list of our Wisconsin blueprint for transition cows. And so in addition to the 4 that were previously mentioned, we also would recommend using headlocks in the pre-fresh pen, but we want to make sure that heifers are introduced to headlocks prior to entering the pen. We also, based on work by Dr. Katie Proudfoot, we want to make sure that cows have a quiet place to calve that has limited disruptions from humans or other farm traffic and noise, or just other cows in the pen. So we see a natural tendency for cows as they near calving to try and seek isolation. And so if we can provide some form of isolation or protection within that maternity pen, we can accommodate her natural behaviors as much as possible. And then we can't forget about great feeds and feeding. That's essential to any transition cow program, as well as excellent screening, efficiency, and accuracy. So it's super important to take the time to train employees to know what they should look for in these transition cow pens. And together, all of these recommendations will set your cows up for success. So now I'm going to narrow in on 3 different aspects of the Wisconsin blueprint, which are non-negotiables. And we're going to start with feed access. So again, we are going to target 30 inches of bunk space per cow, or 75 centimeters, so that all cows can eat at the same time. One study looked at the different feeding behaviors based on the available bunk space per cow. On the left-hand side here, you can see the percent of cows feeding at each time. And then down below is the time of day with when the cows were being milked, fresh feed was delivered, or pushed up, indicated up above. And you can see that at about 32 inches of bunk space per cow, close to 85–90% of the cows are eating when fresh feed is delivered. So what happens when we reduce the bunk space and go down to 24 inches per cow? You can see a slight decrease, so we're just under 80% of the cows feeding when fresh feed is delivered. Again, similar when fresh feed is delivered the second time, and it closely mirrors that of the 32 inches. So in terms of how many inches of bunk space do we want to provide the main lactating cow groups, we're going to target that 24 inches. But we're going to make sure that all of the transition cows have as much possibility to access fresh feed. So we're going to design the bunk space in those pens for 30 inches per cow. And then you can see once feed bunk space is dramatically reduced, we start to see fewer and fewer cows being able to eat at the same time. And what's interesting to note is that both at these lower feed bunk space per cow, these cows that weren't able to feed when the fresh feed was delivered, they're not going back and trying to make up for that lost opportunity. So you're missing over half of the pen there, not being able to get sufficient feed access. Then that leads us to the question, do we want to have a post and rail system or use headlocks? We're going to advocate for headlock use, both in the pre-fresh and fresh pens, because there's less competition with headlocks. You can see here on the left side, we've got the number of displacements per cow per day. And then here at the bottom is the percent of recommended feed bunk space per cow. So you can see even at, above and beyond that feed bunk space per cow, there are few displacements with headlocks, slightly more with post and rail. But as we start to decrease the amount of feed bunk space available to cows, you can see a significant increase in the number of displacements, especially in the post and rail system. So we're going to target headlock use in these transition pens. We want to make sure that heifers have plenty of time to get used to headlocks. We don't want, if this is going to be the first time that heifers are introduced to headlocks, you'll want to provide some area of the pen that is a post and rail system so that they can get used to the headlocks. Then there's always a comfortable place to rest, which is Dr. Cook's foremost component of barn design. And so we can provide two different options for a comfortable place to rest. We can offer a nice sand bedded or deep bedded free stall, or a nice dry, soft bedded pack that's designed for the size of the cows that are using them. And we also want to provide enough square footage per cow in these maternity pens. Resting behavior is impacted by stall comfort, lameness, heat stress, time in the pen, and overstocking. For all cows, we're going to be targeting 12 hours of resting time per day. And so we want to make sure to optimize the bedding environment in order to get those 12 hours a day. So that starts with an appropriately designed stall to fit the cow using them. So you can see here that we've got a nice wide stall that fits this cow perfectly. Research has shown that we see longer resting times in wider stalls. And then when stalls are too narrow for the cows that are using them, we see more lameness in these herds. So it all depends, these dimensions all depend on the size of the animal using the pens. And so if you're interested in figuring out what all the dimensions are, from the width of the stalls to the neck rail placement to where the lower divider rail should be and how far it extends, the Dairyland Initiative has put together a dimensions chart for you, which is available on the Dairyland Initiative website. So because these girls are a little bit bigger than when they were in the lactating cow pen, we're gonna be extra generous in making sure that the width of the stalls is appropriate for these animals. So these far off cows and the close-up mature cows, on average for those big Holstein, 1,600-pound Holsteins, we're gonna be targeting 50 to 54 inches width of stalls. But we don't need to go that much for the close-up heifers. We can go a little bit smaller at 48 inches. We have to compromise when we're housing heifers and close-up cows together. So obviously the 50 inches isn't ideal for our big mature cows, but if we have too many heifers going into these really wide stalls, you're gonna have some messy stalls to deal with. So 50 inches is a nice compromise. And then we're gonna continue that in with the fresh cows. And again, we'll have less numbers for fresh heifers and mixed groups. And for Jersey cows, I take a couple of inches off of these recommendations. Getting back to the importance of that lying time and how bed surfaces affect lying time, this was the largest study done looking at the effect of different surface types on the hours per day spent lying down. And you can see that sand here is the clear winner. We're almost at that recommended 12 hours a day, followed by mats, and geotextile mattresses, concrete, and waterbed. So, you know, sand or any type of deep bedding material, such as manure solids, sawdust, peat moss in Finland, you name it, we're gonna have those similar effects with getting closer to that longer resting time. And so why is sand so great compared to the other surfaces? It's because it's got more give and support. And so when you've got lame animals that have a harder time getting up and down, what's great about sand and deep bedding in general is that when cows are getting up and down, there's some give to the bedding. And then it also, when her claw sinks in, she's getting support from the bedding and is able to get out of the pen. So sand is the gold standard. Of course, sand isn't always practical given the manure system in place. So if you're going to go with a mattress system, I would recommend a rubber crumb mattress. And then we also want to make sure that cows, when they're lying down, they can stay lying down. And with sand, you can see that cows, that cows are lying down for longer times with fewer lying bouts. So on average, resting time on sand was close to 13 hours a day, followed by mattress at 11 and a half. But with sand, we saw a lot fewer lying bouts, and those bout durations were longer than mattress. So again, just more comfort. And when you've got lame cows, you don't want them getting up and down as much. So we want to give them as much of a comfortable resting surface as possible. Then the stall is a micro environment within the pen. So if you've tuned into Dr. Cook's previous Artex webinar, he talked about the importance of heat abatement and ventilation in the barn. So I highly recommend going and viewing that webinar. But for these purposes, again, getting back to the amount of time resting and optimizing the amount of time cows are resting in the pen, we also want to think about heat abatement measures. One thing that's interesting with cows is that when they stand, they cool off, and when they're lying down, they start to accumulate heat. So these orange bars here, down at the bottom, show when the cow is lying down, and the bars at the top show when she's standing up. And this black line here is her core body temperature. And it's interesting to see that when she's lying down, her core body temperature goes up. She has to stand up in order to cool her body again. And then once she lies back down, goes up, and so the cycle continues. And so we want to make sure that we're keeping the cow down and resting and minimizing the amount of heat that she's accumulating in order to keep that resting behavior close to that 12 hours a day. There was a heat stress study done looking at the relationship between heat stress and resting behavior, and the number of lying bouts remained the same even though the temperature increased, but the average lying bout decreased as the temperature got warmer. And you can see that just within a 10-degree THI difference in increased heat, we were losing about 3 to 4 hours of line time per day. So huge shift in line time. And so again, it gets back to how do we cool the microenvironment of the stall, and that gets back to appropriate ventilation, different types of fans over the stalls. Typically, you'll see some 48, 52-inch panel fans placed above the stalls and angled down so that they are aiming fast-moving air at about 200 feet per minute at the back of the cows. And then in order to keep that fast, making sure that each cow that's lying down gets those fast-moving air, we would place the fans every other post, which is about every 24 feet in the barn. And now to stocking density. So again, we want to really, this is one of those areas where we've got to be very diligent in having only one stall per cow. Again, 100 square feet per cow for bedded area. So this study was looking at the effect of overstocking on line time. You can see down below here the different stocking densities. So here you'd have 1 cow per stall, and here you'd have 1.5 cows per stall. The gray columns are the number of displacements, and the orange is the average line time per day. So you can see that as stocking density increased, we lost almost 2 hours of line time, and the number of displacements for cows, poking other cows to get up from the stalls also increased. So you can again see the importance of maintaining an appropriately stocked pen to maximize resting and minimize as many displacements from the stalls. And stocking density also has an effect on milk production. Down below here, we've got the number of cows per stall, and on the left, you see the milk yield. And when you've got, we had herds that were anywhere from 2.5 to a little over more than 1 cow per stall. And these herds were averaging about 44 pounds of milk per cow per day. But you can see as stocking density decreased, milk production increased. So those herds that were a little bit less at 1 cow per stall or less, they were achieving close to 77 pounds of milk per cow per day. Then we want to make sure that we're not regrouping the cows 2 to 7 days before calving. This is the critical period, and we want to minimize as much social stress as possible so that cows are getting appropriate dry matter intake. So this one study looked at the effect of dry matter intake on cows that were moved, and you can see that on the day of the move, there was a 9% decrease in dry matter intake for the cows that were moved pens versus the cows that remained in the pen. There's also been some studies looking at the effects of socially stable systems. And so one study looked at if there was any difference in milk production and whatnot for cows that remained in a social stable group or were moved to a similar pen twice weekly. And really, they didn't see many differences. And same with another study that looked in at this all-in, all-out approach versus a traditional approach. And again, not that much different. So, what are some of the differences that we're seeing between cows that remain in a group versus cows that are moved constantly. And that is, we're seeing significant differences in bunk displacement and feeding time. So there might not necessarily be an economical effect that's immediately realized for cows that are in a all in, all out, or socially stable group, but we can see behavioral changes, and we want to minimize those as much as possible. And so another study looked at the relationship of stocking density and cows being displaced at the bunk. And what this study found was that when you start to reduce the stocking density, you don't see the negative effects of group changes. So space trumps social stability, but both are important. So now that we've covered what the three main areas are of, optimizing the transition cow environment, I'm going to walk you through how to size the transition cow pens. So we have to keep in mind that the Prefresh and maternity pens are the only pens on the farm where the cows get to decide when they leave. And then every cow on the farm will occupy the Prefresh pen at some point during the year. So it's easily a justifiable cost to put improvements into the transition cow barn, because when you're making improvements, you want to think about that throughout the entire herd, not just the number of cows that are occupying the space at any one time. And then we want to overbuild these facilities to accommodate calving surges throughout the year. This is an example of a herd and the average weekly calving rate over a 2-year period. And the average weekly calving rate for both heifers and cows was about 50. However, you can see that we've got periods where there are huge increases in the weekly calving rate. And if we were to have built the barn for the average weekly calving rate, we would be severely limited on bunk space and stall space for these times of calving surges. So we want to overbuild to accommodate as much of those calving surges as possible. So typically we're going to overbuild by 130, 150% of the average. And that may not catch all of these, the huge calving surges. It will catch most, and you'll be able to maintain sufficient bunk space and stall space. So now it's time to get out basic arithmetic. I know everybody misses those days of high school math, and start to look at sizing the transition cow pen. So in order to do this, you want to take the total number of cows in the herd. So that includes both the lactating cows and the dry cows. And to figure out the average number of calvings per day, you're going to look at the total number of cows and multiply that by 1.1. Because after looking through DHI records, we found that about 110% of the herd freshens within that year period. So that includes cows, culled cows, and cows that are coming into the herd. And then you're going to take that and divide that by 365. Then to figure out how much you're going to overbuild, you're going to multiply the average number of calvings by a pen factor. So for pens days that are pen stays, shorter pen stays of anywhere from 2 to 21 days, because we have more days to spread out that calving surge versus when you're only looking at a handful of days. So typically for these typical transition cow pens of 21-day stays, we're gonna target overbuilding 130 to 140% more than the average weekly calving rate. So here's an example for a 300 cow herd. You would to get the average number of calvings per day, that would be 300 times 1.1 divided by 365 days in a week, and you get 0.9 calvings per day. So for a 21-day pen stay, you would use the multiplier factor of 1.4. So take the 21 days in the pen, multiply that by the average number of calvings per day, and then multiply it by 1.4. And we're going to need to overbuild the 21-day pen to house 27 cows. So again, for those shorter stays, we're gonna you're gonna increase this multiplier, and for those longer days, you'll decrease it. But you're still always sizing the barn. You're overbuilding it to accommodate those calving surges. And I know I just made you walk through all that math, but we have a Prefresh cow pen size calculator available as an app for free. So feel free to look that up on the iTunes store, and then you don't have to do any of the math yourself. But it's always important to understand where the numbers are coming from. Now for the different Prefresh pen options. There's 3 different approaches. There's the traditional Prefresh, sequential fill, or the all-in, all-out Prefresh maternity. Traditional Prefresh is the most commonly used management housing system for herds. You typically just have one group or one pen to accommodate the cows and heifers 21 days prior to calving, with individual pens or a group pen for calving cows. This is 2 different examples of ways to lay out the Prefresh pen. Here we've got a head to tail stall platform layout. What's nice about this is that workers never have to enter the pen in order to see if any of the cows are calving. So they're limiting any disturbances in the pen by being able to walk along the feed alley. And then in pens where you've got a head-to-head system, you can have a drover's lane along the back of the pen. So again, no one ever has to enter the pen in order to see if cows are calving. And so both of these systems have nice 2-row pens. What's nice about these 2-row pens is that it protects bunk space, and it's much easier to get that 30 inches of bunk space per cow that we so want in our transition cow pens. For those larger herds, we can think about sequential fill Prefresh. And so we're looking at, herds 1,000, 2,000 or more cows. And this type of system splits that 21-day transition period into 3 weeks or 3 pens for each week. And then depending on the size of the herd, you can build pens specifically designed for cows and those that are specifically designed for heifers. So this farm has separated their Prefresh cows and heifers, and they've built 3 pens for the heifers and then the cows. and the pen is sized to accommodate 1 week's worth of cows. And then every week, the pen down here will replace this pen, and this pen will move up to the next pen. And same for down here with the heifers. Now, you want to overbuild the pens closest to the individual calving area so that you can absorb any of the stragglers from the previous week. So that's about a 10 to 15% overbuild. Then kind of you get to that question of, well, is there social stress for those cows that didn't quite calve within the week? And we see minimal social stress with regrouping when one of the last cows that is remaining in the pen stays in the pen and other cows are introduced. We start to see the social stress when you take a few number of cows and put them into the larger group. So don't have to worry too much here about regrouping stress, but this is just a nice way to keep cows in weekly groups that come closer to the calving area so that any workers can really focus their attention on these pens closest to the individual calving pens. This is a picture of the inside of the previous slide's layout, and you can see that we've got 2 row stalls here. There's 3 different pens for the heifers with the individual pens down here at the very end. And then what is also nice about this design is that there are these gates in between the pens that are furthest from the individual pens. And that's because sometimes you might have a cow that calves early or needs special attention. And instead of having to move the cows in the other 2 pens and trying to move the one cow towards the individual pens through the other pens, you can use these gates and switch between the pens in order to move the cow out into some sort of a drover's lane. So much more labor efficient and can be done by a single person. Then the last pre-fresh option is this all-in, all-out pre-fresh maternity. The UW Dairy Farm in Arlington has this type of system for our transition cows. These pens are designed to accommodate 10 to 12 cows for the duration of their pre-fresh period. So they're in here, once they're in here for 21 days and then calve before the next group comes in and occupies that pen. There's also calving pens on the side just in case you need to get a cow from here that's calving or having difficulty calving down to these calving pens. You can push the gates back and easily move a cow down here. This is least common among pre-fresh approaches, but it's just another option to consider. This, instead of using a bedded pack, this barn uses a freestall system. So they've got 3 separate pens on this side that are occupied by one group for that 21-day period. And then they've got individual calving pens on the side of the main freestall pen to move cows into as they calve. Then for the maternity pen option. So we just covered, what do you do with those cows 21 days prior to calving? So, and now we're going to look at what to do for the calving cows. And there's 3 different maternity pen options, starting with just-in-time calving, where cows are moved from the main group to the maternity pen within hours of birth. So once the calf's feet are showing, the cow is moved into an individual pen. Then there's the short stay maternity pen, typically a bedded pack, where cows are moved there within 2 days of calving. And the less frequent option, but again, another option, is the long stay maternity pen, where cows enter that pen 7 or more days prior to their due date. And you can see again that there's that critical period of 2 to 7 days before calving where we don't want to move cows. So that short stay is focusing on 2 days or less, and the long stay is at 7 days or more. Just-in-time calving requires around-the-clock supervision. So most of the time, just-in-time calving is on those larger herds. You take the cow from a nearby freestall and move her into the individual pen when the calf's feet are starting to show. Oftentimes, you'll have workers that are really afraid of cows calving in the main pen, so they'll move cows too early. So again, this is where it's really important to train workers how to spot when a cow is calving and when it's appropriate to move her into the nearby stall. Here's some examples of individual pens. What we recommend is that fresh straw goes in the pen when the cow enters and that straw leaves with her. Cows have shown preference of calving on straw that's above concrete or sand versus straw over rubber. We want to design these pens so that they have a minimum square foot area of 144 square feet. And we want to make sure that we provide water access here. And then add a gate just in case you need to handle the cow. And then also a nice area to set up the milking unit to hook up for colostrum. And this gets to our importance of having a quiet place to calve. You don't want to put those individual pens near the milking center where cows are coming and going all the time. In that period, about 8 hours prior to birth, you'll see cows start to seek isolation. And so we want to try and accommodate that behavioral change as much as possible. And Dr. Katie Proudfoot has done research looking into this to see how cows do prefer to isolate themselves or seek some sort of private area within the pen as they get closer to calving. Here's some examples of ways to try and divide the commotion that's going on in the rest of the barn with the quietness of the individual calving pens. You can put up different barriers. Of course, this could cause issues for ventilation. We don't want to impede ventilation anyway. So when trying to figure out the best location for these barriers, you'll want to talk to your consultant about that. Otherwise, just a basic room nearby also provides some form of a solid structure for the cow to hide against. And then this is just another option where, of course, the cow is mostly open to the rest of the maternity pen, but she still has an option to seek some sort of privacy by resting against this little barrier. Then instead of that short or the just-in-time calving, we've got the short stay maternity pen where cows are moved to this group pen within 2 days of calving. So this helps reduce the effect of regrouping stress in these cows that 2 days prior to calving. But this approach depends on the worker's abilities to predict the cow calving within 2 days. So this sort of maternity pen management system is more applicable for smaller herds of about 250 cows or less. And in order for this system to be successful, you want to make sure that you have excellent stockmanship and you're able to predict the timing of calving. You want to make sure that the cow isn't away from the group for a prolonged period of time. But you also want to balance the need for having an isolation area. And this is typically coupled with that one group period or like the traditional pre-fresh that I showed earlier. About 70% of the herds that we visited in our transition cow survey is using this type of short stay maternity system where you've got the one group of pre-fresh cows located near to a bedded pack that accommodates cows that are 2 days within calving. And we want to make sure that we're providing a nice dry bed for these girls. So when designing the bedded pack area, you want to make sure that the water is only accessible from the feed alley. So there's many ways of blocking off the water. Here's an example of concrete being used so that cows have to enter into the concrete feed alley to drink, and this helps reduce spoilage in the bedding. We also want to make sure that we don't have very long bedded or deep bedded back bedded areas. So, you know, we don't want cows to have to walk very far to get to the feed bunk. So we're going to cap the depth of the bedded pack to about 30 to 35 feet. Then the last maternity pen option is this long stay maternity pen, which is a nice alternative for herds that are about 350 cows or more that don't want to practice just in time calving. So the idea behind this approach is to move cows from the dry group to a maternity pen each week, and we want to make sure that the group pen is sized to accommodate at least 1 week of calving cows. You can have separate maternity pens if needed within the group pens, or at a nice little isolation area within the group pens to again accommodate that behavioral change as cows get close to calving. So for this type of approach to be successful, you're going to want to avoid regrouping within 7 days of calving. And you want to make sure that you have a sufficient number of group pens to receive 1 week's worth of cows that are at least 7 days or more from the due date. And then we're going to give them ample space in these pens and try and design the bedded pack so that we give a minimum of 120 to up to 150 square feet of bedded area per cow. And so trying to figure out how many different pens you need is a little tricky. So I've outlined the calculation for a 500 cow herd. And so in order to calculate the average number of calvings per week, just like before, you're going to take the total herd size, again, milking and dry, and multiply that by a factor of 1.1. Divide that number by 365, And here in this instance, we get 1.5 calvings per day. Then we need to figure out how much area we need to accommodate cows that are calving over a 14-day period. And so because we're looking at such a short stay, we're going to target a higher overbuild at about 150%. So you're going to take the number of calvings per day and multiply that by 150%, which gives us 2.25 calvings per day. And then over a 14-day period, that's about 31 calvings. So if we have 31 cows that we need to accommodate with 10 cows per group, we're going to end up with about 3 maternity pens of 10 cows each. Now this gets us to the fresh pen management. So this is the cow's 21 days post-calving. From the transition cow survey that we did in 2015, a majority of the Wisconsin farms had a dedicated fresh cow pen. It's nice so you can put cows with the highest risk, you know, those older cows, lame cows, or any of the cows that had trouble giving birth, all in one area. We don't have a set days in milk for when the cow should move from the fresh pen into the lactating cow pen. You know, it really depends on when she's ready to move. Typically, we're going to target about 21 days, but if you're starting to get tight on space requirements, you can always, and the cows are doing well, you can always move the fresh cows into the main lactating cow pen. We've done some research and did another survey looking at facility design and labor efficiency on AMS herds in the Midwest. And one of the questions we get frequently is, so what do you do with fresh cows in an AMS unit? And, you know, can you separate fresh cows in an AMS unit for shorter than what you would do in a conventional herd? Perhaps, you know, you've got the advantage of continuous monitoring, but again, you want to remember that you need to keep an eye out for fresh cow health problems that can occur within 5 to 12 days post-calving. So you really need to do a great job of checking in with these animals if they were to move from calving directly into the main milking pen. And from our experience, we find more success with transition cows that have 24/7 access to the robot. And it also helps with labor. Instead of having to push up these fresh cows or the cows that are in the sick pen on a robot farm 2 times a day, giving them 24/7 access eliminates the need to push them up and let them perform as best they can. And so based on our 2018 UW AMS survey, we looked at the average days in milk that fresh mature cows, so cows with lactation 2 or greater, entered the main milking pen, and that was about 5 days. And heifers spent a little bit more time in a separate pen prior to entering the main milking pen at about 6 days. About 38% of our herds, and we visited about 40 herds, would separate the fresh cows for 1 day or less. And if we looked at the average milk production per cow, those that would move the cows immediately into the main milking pen after calving averaged about 81 pounds a day. Very few herds had cows in a separate pen for 14 days or more. Typically, these fresh pen stays would be anywhere from 7 to 10 days. But for the herds that were separating their fresh cows from the main lactating group for 14 days or more, saw more milk per cow at about 88 pounds of milk per cow per day. So one of the ways, to help increase milk production in these AMS herds and, increase fresh cow performance is to allow that 24/7 access to the robot. You want to position the robot in a way that a separate pen has access to the robot, and then also has a way to redirect the cow into that separate pen, while allowing the cows from the main milking group to enter the robot as well. So here's just a nice example of a perpendicular placed robot stall where cows from the separate group can come in and are automatically redirected back into the fresh pen or separate pen, whatever the farm is using as a separation pen. So again, we don't have any clear answers on how many days should a fresh cow in a automated milking facility be separated from the main milking group, but based on our observations in our survey, it looks like you see better milk performance with cows and heifers that stay at 14 days or more in that separate pen. Lastly, I'm going to quickly run through the pen essentials, basic pen essentials of all of the pre-fresh and post-fresh pens. So again, we want to really focus on limiting the number of rows of stalls in these pens. So that's going to be a 2-row pen. You can either have the stalls placed head to head with a drover's lane so that nobody has to enter the pen in order to see if any cows are calving. And same here with a head to tail layout for the pre-fresh pen. And then the 2-row pens are just as important for the fresh cow pens. And why? And that's because it helps protect the bunk space per the cows. So it's much easier to get 30 inches of bunk space per cow with a 2-row pen versus a 3-row pen. And then we also want to provide at least 2 different points that cows can cross between the resting area and the feed area, and then have water in at least 2 separate locations. We want to make sure that these crossovers are wide enough. So for a single crossover, we're looking at a 14-foot wide crossover with a water. And if there's a double crossover with pens on either side, we can shorten it up to a little bit closer to 26 feet. But in these transition cow pens, we want to put crossovers every 15 to 20 stalls or so. So not only does it make it easier for the cows to access the feed bunk, but it also helps give us more space at the bunk. So that's just a nice little added way to get extra feed bunk space by adding a few more crossovers. And then we want to make sure that there's sufficient water access that's split between at least 2 locations in the pen. And we're going to target about 3.5 inches of water trough perimeter per cow. For our alley recommendations, we want to make sure that they're wide enough so that we can facilitate flow within the pen. So our standards for your stall alley is about 10, feed alley is 12. If the alley is both, accommodating the feed area and the resting area, we'd go a little bit more closer to 13 feet. But from what we're hearing from farms that have gone a little bit wider is that they would not go back to these standards. The optimum is really what you need for optimal flow around the pen, especially in transition cow pens and in pens with AMS systems. And then typically the floors will be sloped at about 1%. And then we want to make sure that there's grooved floors. These are the recommendations for these grooves. Carl Berge also had another webinar looking at foot health in herds that I highly recommend you catch to get much more in-depth detail about this area. But again, grooved floors in all of the lactating and transition cow pens. So you guys did it. You did a great job. Just to summarize, this is your blueprint for transition cow housing. I can't stress enough the importance of providing 30 inches of bunk space per cow for the 21 days before and after calving, having deep, loose bedded free stalls that are sized appropriately to accommodate the cows that are using them, using headlocks in the pre-fresh pen as well as the post-fresh pen, but making sure that you introduce heifers to the headlocks prior to the pen, or give them the option of a post and rail or headlock once they are into the pre-fresh pen. And this helps, again, reduce displacements at the bunk. Then we want to make sure that we're not overstocking the pens, and we're going to be really comfortable, and we are going to limit the stocking density to 1 stall per cow or a little less. And then in a bedded pack system, at least 100 square feet of bedded pack per cow, but of course, more is always better. And then we're going to choose a maternity pen strategy where we are housing cows so that we can minimize the regrouping stress within that critical period of 2 to 7 days before calving. So whether that's just in time, where you're moving cows the day of, when they're showing calf feet, to the short stay maternity pen, where cows are in a group maternity pen for 2 days or less, or the long stay, where cows are in a group maternity pen for 7 or more days. And then no matter what type of maternity pen approach you take, you want to make sure that cows are in a quiet place when they calve and have the option of isolating themselves from the group if they want. And then of course, great feeds and feeding are always a huge part of a transition cow program, and great stockmanship that is efficient and accurate only improves your transition cow program. So for more information about transition cows, feel free to check out our Dairyland Initiative website, where we have virtual tours of transition cow barns. We also have tools accessible on there for sizing your transition cow facilities, looking at a partial budget in terms of transition cow index and improvements to help pay off the investment. And then we also have a transition cow risk assessment app available to download on the iTunes store. So with that, I am very thankful you guys were able to tune in with us today, and I'm happy to take any questions.
And I was on mute, so I apologize. So thank you very much. We actually do have 4 questions for you. The first one is, can we get a copy of the presentation, which we'll definitely get from you and pass on. If you would like it, please email me at marketing@artexbarn.com. The next question is, during heat stress, should we cool down the dry cows with water?
Yes, there's been studies out of Florida that looked at the effects on the transition cow performance as well as calf performance on cooling cows during that dry period. And they did see an effect of using water and fans to mitigate heat stress, to improve health and performance of the dry cows and the calves. So definitely that is an area to invest in for heat abatement.
And we actually have some more information on this. You can find it on our website. We had a presentation done by Dr. Mike Brook, and he did dry cow cooling. So that's ties right in. So what kind of bedded pack do you suggest, and is compost barns an option?
Yeah, so typically in the upper Midwest where I'm located, we'll see a straw bedded pack. It's very hard for us to deal with compost bedding here because of the humidity. But if you're in a drier climate, compost barns work just as well. But again, you want to make sure that you're providing enough bedded pack space per cow. So target 100 square feet up to 150 square feet if possible.
Perfect. So you had said 10 square meters of bed pack per transition cow. Is this total space or resting space per cow?
That's a great question, and that is total resting space. So that 10 square meters or 100 square feet per cow pertains only to the resting space.
How long should the optimal dry period be?
There's slight variations between each farm, but based on the top performing herds in our transition cow survey, the total dry cow period was anywhere between 55 to 60 days.
And the last question, are the tools available now to download on iPhones and Android phones?
iPhones, yes, there are a couple of tools that are available for Androids as well. And all that information can be found on our website. I'm also happy to provide you, Karen, with the links directly.
Perfect. Yes, I'll get those and send those out in the emails along with a link to this presentation for you to review. So thank you very much, Courtney. We really appreciate your time, and thanks everybody who joined us.
Thank you.